Kunihi ke ahi aka hoe. Kunihi ke ahi aka hoe. Kila kila I ka ua pua kea. Hano hano lua ole o kane ohe. Ina pua hiva hiva I ohi ia. Kui ia maila I ke kaula alava. Ile ia aloha ho io na ko ola ue. Kunihi ke ahi aka hoe. Kunihi ke ahi aka hoe. Kila kila I ka ua pua kea. Hano hano lua ole o kane ohe. Ina pua hiva hiva I ohi ia. Kui ia maila I ke kaula alava. Ile ia aloha ho io na ko ola ue. Ayala kanu uliare.
Yes. Check the mic. Hello, hi, aloha, aloha kako. Welcome to the symposium, Archives and Political Processes, a case study on the history of the H-3 Freeway. My name is Ellen Ray Cachola, and I'm the Evening Supervisor and Archives Manager at the University of Hawaii School of Law Library. I want to thank the Andrew W. Mellon Fellowship for Diversity, Inclusion, and Cultural Heritage at Rare Book School, the University of Hawaii School of Law Library, the University of Hawaii at Manoa Hamilton Library, and the Windward Community College Library for their support in making this event possible. The structure of this hybrid program is that we have in-person and virtual attendees today. Some housekeeping for in-person attendees. Bathrooms are to the left of the third floor elevators outside. Please help yourself to any refreshments anytime you want to munch on something or you want to drink anything, it's back there. Please hold any questions for group discussion during the Q&A section after all panelists have presented. For our online attendees, please do comment in the question box if you have any problems, technical difficulties in hearing, or the slides aren't showing up. And we have a Zoom moderator that can help you with that. But if you have any questions for group discussion, please leave them in the Q&A box. We will check later during the Q&A section for your questions. Our project committee thought deeply about the sensitivity of the political history of the H-3 freeway, which, if you look outside, is the freeway structure clinging to the mountain. We placed hope in the benefits of bringing up this history based on archival papers from federal, state, and community sources. At the moment, the information has been siloed in different places. Also, we were not able to present all sources from different perspectives because of access restrictions, copyright, short time frames, and not enough relationships to ensure the trust required for sharing and collaboration. But we were able to build this project with some sources. We curated them in juxtaposition to help break down the silos and increase access to understanding other sides, unknown or misunderstood before, and how this could support learning. We wanted to ask everyone in person and online to hold these community norms in your mind as we move through today. Be respectful and accepting. Strive to challenge our personal biases and preconceived stereotypes by approaching different understandings or opinions with openness and curiosity. Be aware of how your words and actions may harm others, intentional or not. Take time to educate ourselves on ways to be inclusive and actively listen when someone takes the time to educate you. Be conscious of power and privilege dynamics. If you find you are talking a lot, consider stepping back to leave more space for others. Be constructive in offering feedback, and if necessary, be gracious in accepting it. When and if disagreement arises, respectful discourse is encouraged. This symposium will start with the part 1, when librarians, archivists, and students will share their process for creating this online resource that documents the political processes behind the H-3 freeway. Then there will be a 10-minute intermission. After that, the part 2 of the symposium will welcome community leaders and professionals, Mahelani Seifer, Tom Dye, Jennifer Sabas, and Kavena Komeji, who will comment on this web resource and how it relates to their own personal experiences of the political processes surrounding the H-3. So please stay tuned. So without further ado, let's begin the part 1 of our symposium. I would like to call up the archivists, librarians, and students who played a role in producing this resource. First, I'll call Don Suioka, Congressional Papers Archivist, UH Manoa Hamilton Library, Dori Minatodani, Hawaiian Pacific Collections Librarian from Hamilton Library, Gwen Sinclair, Government Documents Librarian, Hamilton Library. So come on up. And then the second part, I will call Kyle, Kealohi, Perry, and yes, so stay tuned for them.
Right. Hello, Maikako. My name is Dawn Sueoka, and I work at the UH Manoa Library, where I'm the archivist for the papers of Hawaii's members of Congress, including the papers of Senator Daniel K. Inouye, Senator Spark Matsunaga, Senator Hiram Fong, Congressman Tom Gill, and Congressman Neil Abercrombie. There are many documents from our library's congressional collections that are featured in the website that we're going to share today. I'm also the instigator of this project, and I'd like to kind of introduce the website by sharing a little bit about how it came about. In my job, I work with people who are doing research on topics that are primarily related to Hawaii and the federal government. So topics like the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act, redress for Japanese Americans incarcerated during World War II, the Compacts of Free Association, NAGPRA, the Akaka Bill, and other topics. And in supporting these researchers, it became really clear to me just how interconnected our political archives are. I found myself regularly referring researchers to related documentation in other collections, like the Hawaiian collection, like the government documents collection, like the law library archives, the state archives, and other repositories across Hawaii. So I reached out to other UH Manoa librarians and archivists who also support people who are doing 20th and 21st century Hawaii political research. And we kind of reflected on our experiences supporting these researchers, and we discussed some of the things that make it challenging to do this kind of research. I think two of the biggest challenges that we identified were first, that intersecting political processes at multiple levels of government are very confusing and convoluted. And second, records documenting different aspects of Hawaii politics are spread out across multiple libraries and archives. And it's not always easy, even for librarians and archivists, to figure out what records are housed where. So we decided to work together to create some kind of resource that would help to address these challenges. And ultimately continue to build capacity for more Hawaii political research and engagement by students, historians, and the general public. Now, it's one thing to consider political processes in the abstract. I think we're all familiar with those kind of very tidy diagrams about how a bill becomes a law. And it's another thing to kind of try to retrace how these processes play out in the real world. And so the most effective way to illustrate those processes, we felt, was going to be through a case study. We wanted to find a topic that spanned multiple levels and branches of government, something that embodied conflicting perspectives and interests, and something that spanned a long time period. And we did consider rail as a potential case study, and ultimately we chose the H-3, not specifically to be controversial, but rather, as Ellen kind of alluded to, as a way to support learning about political processes and political research, and as a way to inspire more political engagement by the public. So in keeping with those goals, the website is really, it's not intended to be an exhaustive or definitive history of the H3, and it's not intended to like be an archive of this history. You can think of the website more like a series of frameworks that can be used to research and engage with other Hawaii political issues. That said, and Ellen mentioned this too, we're very much aware of the anger and pain that people still experience as a result of the H3. So I want to be clear that the symposium today is not intended as a listening or talk story session about what should or shouldn't have happened over the course of the H3's history. I think those conversations are really important. But in order to responsibly create a safe space for that kind of discussion, we would need to set this up in a totally different way, have a lot more support and structure and scaffolding, and facilitators who have that specific kind of training and experience. What the symposium today is really focused on is this website. It's focused on Hawaii political research and the role of libraries and archives in supporting that kind of research and housing that kind of documentation. For instance, what kind of records end up in archives? What's missing from the archives? What is the role of libraries and archives in helping the public to engage with these histories and apply those lessons to the political decisions that we're making in this current moment? And for me, that's my ultimate hope for archival collections, is that researchers and the public will be able to use what they learn from archives to help inform and guide our decision-making today. And finally, before I turn it over to Dory to walk everyone through the website, I wanted to share the parts of the website that I worked on. I worked on the page about support for the H3. I worked on the page about the legislative process and the US Congress and H3. I worked on the timeline, and then I also wrote the brief history and the introductory text. So thank you folks again for being here, both the folks in the room and the folks on Zoom, and I'll go ahead and pass it over to Dory.
For the folks in the room, we actually have a lot of people who can you give a sense of how many people are joining us? 55.
Aloha. Wait, let me get a little close. Aloha, my name is Dory Minautudani. I'm a librarian with the Hawaiian Collection at Hamilton Library. Now I can really get into it. My work on this project has been in two areas. I supervised our intern, Kelohi Minami, who you will meet shortly. And I worked on putting the website together with Kyle Hart, who you will also meet shortly. But let's have a look at the website. Can I move this?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, I know you want to control the room there. Okay. So I'll start at the main page, which provides an explanation of what this project is about and why we chose H3 as the case study, which Don covered just a minute ago. The page also includes an explanation of the project components, which are listed down below here, and then also up top here all along the navigation bar. So you should be able to get to this at any time while you're working your way through the site. For those of you who need it, a brief history is a quick overview of the H3 history, covering early years, support and opposition, and H3 today. And then in greater detail, we have the timeline. So the timeline lays out our areas of focus. And I'll just take a moment to scroll through here. I'm not sure if it's truly visible to the people in the room, but for the folks online, I think it might be a little more visible. So through the timeline, we cover the history of the H3. And what you'll see from the initial view is that for each timeline event, there's a date, a brief description, and then for each timeline event, or most of them, some of them don't have a process. Some of them just couldn't be categorized, like the overthrow. There is a category called processes, and that's on the furthermost right column. The processes for this project, we used 7 processes: Kanaka, legislative, regulatory, contested case. A contested case is a regulatory process, but we split it out. Judicial, opposition to the H3 being built, and support for the H3 being built. Let's have a look at the legislative process page as an illustration. The the legislative process is described. And further described as how it applies to H3. And then finally, where to locate the documentation that's left behind from this process. So for each of the processes, there's a page which is similarly structured. All right, so let's get back to the timeline. Ooh, a lot of scrolling. You'll notice that the timeline includes pre-colonial or traditional Hawaiian activity, which we classify as the political process Kanaka. I'm going to take a moment here to say that we engaged in some debate about whether these should be on the timeline. The debate was less about whether these events belonged in the story, but more about keeping the timeline short and punchy. At that time, the timeline had far fewer events, but it can't be denied that we were debating whether these events were going to be included in the main timeline, which is a question of inclusion or exclusion. We ended up keeping the Kanaka events in and adding in more events that we all agree now tell a richer story. I credit Ellen and Kyle for keeping us going in that direction, and I hope Ellen will be able to take a moment to talk about that. But back to the timeline. Let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger. There we go. So one of the features of the timeline is that some of the events have a GIS illustration. So let's pop this one open and have a look at it. Oops. So you can zoom in and out on these and get a sense of, where this is. And this one has one of those fun sliders. Go back to the timeline. So another feature of the timeline is that each event includes a selection of resources that document or otherwise give some insight into the timeline event. Let's look at event 49. The H-3 project is exempted from the requirements of Section 4F. Section 4F is part of the Federal Transportation Act. It requires parks, recreation lands, wildlife refuges, and historic sites to be considered during transportation project development. Section 4F had been used successfully to eliminate other sites from being used for the H-3 route. Getting the H-3 project exempted from Section 4F was key to getting the project done, and people on both sides of the H-3 debate had a lot to say about it. So I'll pop this open, and you'll see the resources that were selected for this timeline event. So we have some things that are announcements from Senator Inouye, letters in support of the 4F exemption, and then letters in opposition to the 4F exemption. This one is a little bananas. They're not all this. Thanks. Ellen did this one. But this gives you a really nice illustration of the kind of content that can be found in some of the repositories that we visited. And you can see that all of the letters and documents can be found in Senator Inouye's papers, which Dawn is taking care of. When a resource in the timeline was found in one of the repositories that we visited for this project, there's a description of the repository. The repository description includes some very practical information about how to use the repository. And a description of what might be found in the repository. And last but not least, each timeline event includes a list of the parties involved with that event. And of course, that's just pretty selective. We identified the parties that appear in the timeline most frequently and wrote a brief description for the top 10 of those parties. So this is an example. This is a description of the State Department of Transportation. Let's see. Do I have time for one more? Okay. Oh, we are? Oh gosh, I'm sorry. I'll just show one more timeline event and then I'll get off here. Timeline event 70, the occupation of Halava Valley begins. And I chose this one just because it has, I think, a more diverse selection of resource types. I have some video from Ulu Ulu at West Oahu, some newspaper content, and then even some radio programs in Hawaiian. So that's our website. And I'll stop here. And I think, Gwen, you're up next.
I moved here in 1993, and I started hiking the Sierra Club, and I was going on a hike on the Idea Route Trail, and just looking down at what was then the unopened H-3 down at Halava, and thinking, wow, who put a freeway there? And I also remember going to Honolulu at the Botanical Garden and being there before the freeway opened, and you didn't hear any traffic noise. Trees blowing in wind and so forth. So I wasn't involved in any of the protests against H-3. We used to talk about it. Okay. Or I wasn't involved in any of the
How about that? Is that better? Okay, sorry about that. I wasn't involved in any of the protests against H-3, but I did make a commitment not to drive on the freeway. I joined this project at Dawn's invitation, and I think she tapped me because I have expertise in government information. I teach a government information class in the Library and Information Science program at UH Manoa, and I also wrote an open textbook about government information in Hawaii. It's called Government Information, a Reference for Librarians in Hawaii. And in that book, I cover a lot of government processes and how one would find documentation about those processes. So as you might imagine, I worked on some of the process pages. I worked on the regulatory processes page. I worked on the contested case page. Ellen and I both worked on the judicial processes page. And that one was a doozy to do, to try to figure out all the different court cases and appeals and so forth and explain them. And that was also the challenge in all of these pages, is just being able to understand a government process sufficiently, since we're not lawyers, we don't do this on a day-to-day basis, but to be able to understand it sufficiently to write an explanation for somebody in layperson's terms. And I also worked on the parties pages, which, as Dory just mentioned, we just did the top 10, the 10 who were the most mentioned in the timeline. So we didn't cover all the different parties that were involved in H3. And that was also challenging because those pages are very short. So we had to distill all of the activities of those parties into a very short narrative. So I guess that's, museum people do this all the time, but librarians are maybe not so accustomed to being so brief. Now on to what I hope to get out of the symposium. Some of our collections are based on provenance. So for example, Dawn's collection is materials mostly received from members of Congress. My collection consists mostly of government documents that are received through depository systems or by being on agency mailing lists. But I'm often asked to help researchers for help finding government records that are not part of my collection. So librarians and archivists are in the position where we must learn about collections outside of our institutions so that we can intelligently refer researchers to those resources. And we also need to know the strengths and limitations of our own collections. Gary Fitzpatrick, who is a map librarian who is the co-author of 3 books about the history of the mapping of Hawaiian Islands, did a talk one time for the local chapter of the Special Libraries Association. And he exhorted us to do research projects in our own collections so that we would have greater expertise and deeper knowledge of our collections. And his argument, of course, makes a lot of sense to me, but I think it's necessary not only to do research in our own collections, but also to reach out and use the collections of other institutions. The creation of this website allowed us to reach beyond our own narrow focus and to think more broadly about H3 and all of the repositories and groups that are relevant to its study. The symposium has also raised many questions about the practice of building collections based on provenance versus intentionally building collections to support the study of subjects, places, or social movements. At a recent sign waving event that I attended that was at Ala Beach Park in support of libraries, a man who was just walking by said to me, "The problem I have with libraries is that they are run by the government." Now that really made me stop and think. If people don't believe that government libraries and archives are trustworthy repositories, where do we go from here? If we take government out of the equation, can non-governmental organizations muster the resources to permanently house these materials with the assurance of data integrity, security controls, and adequate environmental and fire protection? There's a lot more to say about that question, but unfortunately, I only have 4 minutes to talk, so my time is almost up. But I hope the questions raised in the symposium guide us in being thoughtful and strategic about how libraries and archives collaborate on collection building and access in the future. Mahalo. And now Ellen will talk about her part in this process.
Greetings. My name is Ellen. I worked on the opposition page, but offered some words and citations to the judicial Kanaka and timeline pages. I chronologically analyzed legal documents, manuscripts, and news clippings from the Law Library's H-3 litigation archive, which were some papers from the Stop H-3 Association, the Center for Oral History's collection on the opposition to the H-3, the Hawaii Peace and Justice, formerly AFSC Hawaii papers, and the Marian Kelly papers. The different points of opposition included protecting pre-contact Kanaka Maoli cultural and historical sites in Moanalua, Kaneohe, Haiku, and Halawa valleys, and preventing urban sprawl through investing in sustainable transportation systems that would decrease dependence on cars and oil on our finite island space. The opposition movements created records litigating in the courts, lobbying at the state and federal agencies, gaining news coverage, and educating communities through events, rallies, marches, land occupations, and civil disobedience. The opposition experienced power inequality in different times of their resistance because the freeway was backed by the US military, federal, and state departments that had more political, financial, labor, and media resources to justify the construction of the freeway as positive and inevitable. Some members of the opposition confronted the administration of the Bishop Museum, a mainstream cultural institution, for suppressing archaeological findings of pre-contact Kanaka Maoli cultural sites and heiau, temples, disinterred by the freeway's construction. Since the freeway was constructed, Kanaka Maoli organizations have reclaimed cultural sites throughout Halawa and Kaneohe, such as at Haleopapa, Haiku Valley, and Luluku, to revitalize them and educate people about their significance. Timeline dates of these pre-contact sites are historical evidence that informed part of the H-3 opposition's political purpose of advocating and valuing Kanaka Maoli cultural heritage, which had been systematically oppressed by US colonization. Therefore, these sites informed Hawaiian movements to heal or to practice decolonization, sovereignty, independence, and demilitarization until this very day. It was through the Malama Ina Ahapua'a program at the UH Manoa College of Social Science Service Learning that I connected our project committee to participate in a work day to learn more about Haiku Valley from the perspective of Kanaka Maoli stewards like Mahealani Cipher. It was important for us to go to these places and meet community leaders taking care of these heiau, because libraries and archives do not hold all the knowledge of this topic. Our information field is still grappling with legacies of Western and settler colonization, creating spatial and funding politics in what materials and perspectives are trusted, acquired, preserved, and accessed. To complement and deepen what we knew from the text, we needed to be open to Indigenous ways of knowing that history and memory are also in the land and in the people who are close to it. Stewarding community organizations are building their own archives and cultural repositories. Institutional archivists and librarians can pluralize the sources of where historical information is located by investing in partnerships and pathways to learn from communities already caring for cultural sites and materials. Due to the debates that took place during the unfolding of the H-3, trust building came up for me in this work. What are the ethics of what we are doing? How do we become literate to feelings of responsibility, accountability, and mutuality when sensing political inequality in the documented and undocumented sources? How do we articulate that in our archival and library work that comes from traditions of neutrality and objectivity? What new political questions emerge when we put different ways of knowing about the H-3 in conversation? Thank you. So I'm gonna now call Kyle, Kealohi, and Perry to continue the discussion about how this resource was created.
All right, aloha mai kako. My name is Kyle Hart. I was initially drawn to this project when the job advertisement that Dawn had put out was kind of blasted out to the entire graduate department at UH Manoa and the Hawaiian Studies Department. As a Hawaiian Studies graduate, both from the master's program and the undergraduate program, you know, I've kind of taken a front seat to seeing how hard to access a lot of the information that we have here in Hawaii is, especially when it comes to political processes. And that's just because of the nature of the way, you know, our own timeline has transpired here in Hawaii, you know, with changing governmental systems, varying states of sovereignty. So there's just a lot of things to wade through. And so, you know, I definitely see the usefulness of a project like this. My personal research interests, just so you guys know how I came to like fit into this project, they center around peeling back the colonial layers in Hawaii and envisioning a future that is decentralized from these American epistemologies and instead centered around those of Kanako Iwi. And that was a big part of this project for me. Looking past the, you know, the practicality, the practical uses of this freeway that we have out here that basically bisects the entire island. And instead of, and moving past that and, you know, looking at the spiritual side of the matter, looking to see how this process, how these processes made people feel, how was the community impacted, how was the Aina treated, how has overall well-being been impacted. Considerations like this are why I do the research I do, and why when I go out to do research, I seek to make connections. And I think what really drew me to this project is there was that opportunity for the connections to be made because it was such a comprehensive approach to the research itself. And the more comprehensive the approach to the research is, the more connections can be made, and the more intimate you become with the research process itself and with the other people in that community who are also involved with the processes. So really it comes down to connections being made. You know, that's one of the biggest things I got out of this. And one of the things that drew me towards it is I felt like it was a good place to make those connections to, you know, both to the community and to Aina. My involvement in making this resource, which you kind of heard talked about just by a couple other people, I conceived the layout and executed the look of the entire website according to the inputs and the wishes, of course, of the entire project team. Dory and myself worked very closely with each other, especially from this last summer until now, to fill this kind of like empty framework that we had put together for the website itself, so to make it available to all of you. And then Ellen and myself co-authored the Kanaka page, which she also mentioned. And there were certain events throughout the entire timeline which we felt were especially noteworthy, which we wanted to you know, give you a visual for. And when Doria was pulling up the ArcGIS page that had the maps and the drawings on them, that's what we were trying to do there. We were trying to incorporate that place-based aspect of the learning process here, which is so important here in Hawaii. That place-based aspect has to be there whenever you're doing any type of research. The significance of this resource, as I've already talked about, you know, in Hawaiian studies, and information is just all over the place. And so where I found myself, the position I found myself in time and time again is like, where do I find this information I'm looking for? Because it could be in a bazillion different places. And sometimes it just likes to like pop in and out of his existence at whim. And so you don't really know where to find it. So this, having just an organizational framework to go about in tackling some of these bigger things like the H-3 freeway, or right now I'm looking at extant Konahiki fisheries on Molokai Island. All these repositories, it's just so hard to wade through. And so the fact that all these people went through such a great effort to put together an organizational framework to, you know, to attack that information and make sense of it is huge. And it was definitely something that I think we were lacking. There wasn't like a very like straightforward process for tackling those political processes, especially you know, when you get outside of when you're in Hawaii, but you get outside of that Hawaiian studies like field, when you start getting into incorporating Western processes and stuff also. as I think about like going into the future and applying this research into other places, I, since I was mostly tech aspect of this, getting the information that everyone was putting together and putting on the website, I don't know that I have any major lessons learned from this process itself, but being a Hawaiian studies practitioner, as I look to see what we've done here, I look to see that what all these amazing people have been talking about through entire process. And I find myself thinking like, okay, I don't have a lesson learned here, but as I go through and try to apply this on, Molokai or wherever else this research may take us, it's going to be interesting to see how those processes, like if they change, if they become more fluid, if they tend to interact more in different situations. So I'd say like moving forward, using this research, I just want to trying to keep an open mind and learn to be flexible, with the setting that we have here in Hawaii. So yeah.
Mahalo Kyle for sharing your thoughts. Aloha mai kako o wau ke alohi lani minami. Noho wau ma Kaleponi I ka aina o Tangwa. A ka o Maui ku aina hanau. Hello everyone, my name is Kealohilani, or Kealohi for short. I grew up in Southern California on Tongva land, which is known as LA County, Los Angeles County. But my family is from Maui, from the west side. Very proud. And so my involvement in this project is that I was a Kekaulike intern through Native Hawaiian Student Services, partnered with Hamilton Library and the Hawaii Pacific Collection. I was working with Dory as well as Don for a bit of time in different repositories and archives. And that was my role in this project, being able to go through many different sources at the Hawaii State Archives, universities, digital archives, photos. I was kind of the on the ground eyes and ears searching through these sites and seeing everything that's out there. So that was a really amazing experience because prior to this, I'm a political science major and I hadn't done archival work before. Excuse me. Yeah, it was a really amazing experience to be able to learn through this tool of archives. It's a tool at the end of the day, something that we can dive into to see our past so that we can inform where we're going in the future. And so my understanding of H-3 prior to this, because my ohana is from Maui, I have a couple folks who were in Oahu, and so I'd hear their opposition to it, to the H-3 construction, as well as that they don't drive on it at all. And so once I saw this opportunity, I wanted to dive in and just learn as much as I can, because I think to be Hawaiian in Hawaii is to be inherently political and cultural at the same time, and know that no matter what it is that we're doing, whether it's, Mauna Kea, Red Hill, H-3, these are all issues that'll just continue to move forward, and it'll constantly be this back and forth struggle between government and community. In understanding how Western epistemologies and Indigenous knowledge just sometimes don't interact as well with each other as they should. And moving forward, knowing that we can utilize both resources, utilize both knowledge to come to an understanding and find a middle ground that can validate and recognize the validity, the mana, the responsibility we have to steward Hawaiian knowledge, Hawaiian aina, is so important. And so another one of my intentions of coming into this project was to be able to demystify archives for students and young people, especially young Kanaka who are interested in, finding more about genealogy, finding more about our history of resistance throughout Hawaii for many generations. I think that this is something that we can all learn to do, and it's very intimidating at first. Even I've had conversations with folks, I have no idea what an archive is or where to start, or how are we supposed to even find this information. And so being able to disseminate that and make sure that we feel empowered to take up space in these areas that aren't as accessible and can be intimidating is really important to me. So as I was going through the archives, I was able to scan documents and photos that I felt were relevant and captured what I thought was a very glaring reality that a lot of government documents and offices utilize these resources and leverage them against Hawaiians in our fight to protect Aina. And so being able to, see them written explicitly on paper in these hidden files that are not hidden, they're public very much so, but, being able to find them and bring them to our Lahui was very important to me. And so at the Lahui Hawaii Research Conference that was held this past spring, I was able to host a workshop where we had photos and documents, and we put them together and had a discussion, talk story, all about the history of H3 and different perspectives, the mo'olelo that people carry with them from their ohana, how people were involved back in their time as well. Coming to that collective memory was very important, and that's really what the power of archives is, because archives hold a collective memory that we can use and reinsert our voices as Hawaiians into the space to be re-empowered. And so we're going to be looking at them later during the intermission. Very glad there's about 18 people who decided to contribute to our archive. You can also find them on the website. And it's really amazing. Honestly, it blows my mind to see Hawaiians so energized and, ready to put all of that eha and, mana into something like H3, even though, it was built and there was so much resistance to it over time. It really does speak to the power of our kupuna to utilize their tools and resources to resist for 37 plus years, even to this day, how there's still work being done, as Miss Ellen was sharing. And that is something that we will always stay grounded in. And I think moving forward for all archival projects in Hawaii, we need to stay grounded in the Aina, as Ellen was saying, that there's stories in the people, in the land itself, in the places. And I think for me personally, I wouldn't have felt as grounded in this project if we didn't go to Ha'iku Valley and be able to really malama and go right up, take a hike up to where the H3 construction was, seeing all of the debris and the construction materials still left out there today, hearing the resilience and the stories of all the people involved and who are still, bringing that mana back to the land and sharing that life with others in the community is a very magical thing. And I think it needs to be recognized. Thank you, Auntie Mahealani Cypher, and, a dear friend, comrade, Kaino Bronson Azama, who always encourages us to, keep pushing back and keep questioning authority and continue to be insistent, be Hawaiians who will not stand down and will utilize all the tools, no matter whether they're in the government or the university, leveraging all of them to come to this collective moving forward together into a better future that our grandkids can enjoy and the future generations will know the mana of these lands. Mahalo.
Yes.
Okay, there we go. This is me. Aloha, everyone. My name is Perry Arrowsmith. I am currently trying to defend my thesis, so I'm attempting to wrap up my time with the Department of Urban and Regional Planning. I currently work full-time with the governor's office. Right before I started working full-time with the governor's office, however, I was very privileged to be involved with this project. So I guess just in terms of sharing my own impressions and my own reflections on this project, I'd like to start off by talking about how I got to this project and how I got to know Dawn. And that had been in my capacity as a research assistant on another project with UH Hamilton Libraries, where similar to this project, I had to go around and look at other archives throughout the state and the various collections within UH Hamilton Library to identify and effectively compile a bibliography of the Hawaiian Homes Commission's records. And that was alongside another archivist, Helen Wong Smith, and I've learned a great deal from her. But I guess as a part of that project, I also got to become more familiar with the work that Dawn did. And so when this opportunity popped up, and I want to say late September, early October, I remembered hearing from Dawn, and she started talking to me about this project. And I think a sign to me of how important this project was an article that appeared about a couple weeks after our first conversation in the Honolulu Civil Beat. It was by a man named George Cooper, whom some of you might know. He's the author of Land and Power in Hawaii and George Cooper talked about the enduring influence of that work. And in the essay he wrote for Honolulu Civil Beat, he talked about how before he got to Land and Power, he tried to write a history of the H-3 and the H-3's construction alongside Gavin Dawes. And as an aside, I really am curious if Gavin Dawes or George Cooper ever wrote anything. I asked George if he saved any papers. He said, no, I threw them away, which breaks my heart a little bit. But I think that gets to the essence of why this project is so important. It's about, well, it's a matter of, I think the fact that here in Hawaii, we don't have a lot of historical memory, and I've seen that having worked in various offices, not only within the state government, but within the city and county of Honolulu. And my own, having been with the Department of Urban and Regional Planning, one of my favorite books of all time is called The Power Broker, and it's by a man named Robert Caro. And the book is about a man named Robert Moses, who is involved in the physical construction of New York in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. And I thought to myself, well, if somebody in Hawaii ever wanted to gain that level of understanding of how modern Hawaii got built, how would they do so? Where would they start? And that's where this project is so important, because this project is a foundation for the formation of not just a singular history, but of many histories. And I think it's going to enable a lot of people to turn every page when it comes to getting a full story, a full history of how the H-3 got built. And it's also going to provide a model for other major construction projects that have and will influence the landscape of Hawaii. Another example, of course, right now that's very germane, is the rail transit project. Perhaps in due time, the story of how Lahaina recovers and the gathering of documents related to the recovery and the resilience of the community of Lahaina in West Maui. Perhaps we'll be using this as a model for gathering those histories, gathering records. This is just a very powerful project. I left in about December of 2022 to work in the administration, but before I did that, I'd like to just briefly share what I did with this project, and then I'll turn it back over to our other panelists. I leveraged my background going to the state archives and going through the papers of people like John A. Burns, George Ariyoshi, and John Wehe'e to basically begin identifying what papers figures like Kealohi would eventually go in and look through, so that those could be scanned and perhaps eventually compiled, put online. I also went through and compiled a de facto bibliography on Zotero, working with Don and Dory a little bit. We also, discovered that, the Ethnic Studies Department had already digitized a lot of documents through Scholarspace, but those are here and there, and they're a little bit hodgepodge. And that's really the story of the H-3's records relating to the construction of the H-3. They're all over the place. And this, again, is a project that's now centralizing those resources. It's a starting point. It's a foundation for understanding. And here in Hawaii, we have a political culture of planning that's never been adequately defined. But I think if we can get more scholars to begin researching the history of the construction of H-3, maybe we can come to a better understanding of defining what the political culture of planning is here in Hawaii. That's just a little bit about my contribution. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, Part 1 panelists. Thank you for sharing all the hard work that went behind the creation of this resource. So now I want to encourage everyone, if you do have questions for group discussion, please hold them off till after we do the part 2. And I want to transition now to the intermission, but please feel free to shuffle around, get some refreshments. We have 10 minutes, around there to kind of do intermission. And I'll also be playing the slide share of Kealohi's artwork from the Lahui Research Conference. And then also I'd like to call part 2 panelists to come up to the front in a minute as well. So thank you.
A day to Malama Aina in Haiku Valley in the Ahupa of He'ea on the Mokupuni of Oahu. Haiku is a wahipana known for la'au lapa'au and a day to Malama Aina in Haiku Valley in the Ahupa of He'ea on the Mokupuni of Oahu. Haiku is a wahipana known for la'au lapa'au and home to many heiau and now the notorious H-3 highway created to connect military bases in Kaneohe and Pu'uloa. This was a 37-year-long struggle for Hawaiians protecting Aina, iwi kupuna, and ultimately ways of life and self-determination. We were fortunate to hike up close to the highway and see the destruction firsthand, not to mention the metal construction material left behind, as well as this photo of a thick wire left behind that was consumed by this tree's growth. The beauty of Napali o Ha'uli'uli with ka'ohu, or light cloudy mist resting atop referenced in this mele, is seen in this clip, and we can imagine what this place looked like more than 70 years ago before H3 was built. We also visited the decommissioned Coast Guard Omega Station that closed in 1997 and once had dangerous levels of electricity flowing through them with wires that went to the top of the ko'olau. Today, they hope to transform it into a thriving community space. Mahalo nui ya Anake Mahialani Cipher, Hi'ilani Vai, Ko'olau Foundation, and many others who create this opportunity to Malama Aina and share Namo'olelo for us to carry. Although a highway that caused destruction was built, we continue to fight for life of Namea Kanu and Kanaka Oiwi to flourish for future generations. So I hope you spend A day to Malama Aina in Ha'iku Valley in the Ahupua of He'ea on the Mokupuni of Oahu. Ha'iku is a day to Malama Aina in Ha'iku Kawaihona Palapalo, Hawaii, or the State Archives, rests just beyond Iolani Palace through the banyan trees and is a home to documents, maps, records, and photographs in contemporary and kingdom history. It is open to the public and just requires a check-in with the form of an ID. There's lockers at the front to leave your belongings since only laptops and stapled papers are allowed inside. Archives are sites of historical record keeping that create and recreate our collective memory and national identity throughout time. I'm researching political processes through H-3 construction, however there's countless other topics within, including Mahele and Mo'oku'auhau genealogy records. My intention is to demystify archives for young people so we feel comfortable accessing historical knowledge because it does seem intimidating at first, but I believe we have the power to learn Ike that informs our present by looking to the past of our kupuna and holomua by continuing to move forward in ways that empower the lahui. What will you research at?
Hui, e hele mai ka waihona palapala ma ke kulanui o Manoa. I'm a Ke Kaulike intern with Hamilton Library and Native Hawaiian Student Services. Working with a group of librarians and archivists, we're creating a database tracing H-3 construction to better understand the political process. These pahu I'm searching through in the congressional papers, one of the many places that we've located documents to make it easier for researchers and students to find. To holomua, we must know the past to inform our future. Archives are a kipuka to see how institutions have been leveraged against us, and how our lahui has fought to protect Aina, iwi kupuna, and everything that makes Hawaii special.
back,
me.
Tom.
I was talking our professor Ross Porty works at West Law. He was talking about you.
I bet he was. I'm going to talk about him today.
Oh yeah, he sent me several long email about his time with H3 and everything. So it's kind of cool to hear from him too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, he would have been actually better here than me.
Well, he was like, I'm sure Tom will talk.
Ellen.
Well, he was my supervisor.
The 17 cases of files that I
So
told
when
you
I
about
went
that
to SHPD,
Amelia
I
had.
just out of graduate school, I come back here, back home, to start my
For like 5 years. I'm gonna bump
for a while at HPU, White City College back then. And I knew I didn't do that. And so
You had to
I'd
write
like to
those
get
two.
back.
A day to Malama Aina in Ha'iku Valley in the Ahupua of He'ea on the Mokupuni of Oahu. Ha'iku is a wahipana known for La'au Lapa'au and home to many heiau and now the notorious H-3 highway created to connect military bases in Kaneohe and Pu'uloa. This was a 37-year-long struggle for Hawaiians protecting Aina, iwi kupuna, and ultimately ways of life and self-determination. We were fortunate to hike up close to the highway and see the destruction firsthand, not to mention the metal
Check, I'm back again. Hello. So we're now starting for part 2. And the questions that will guide our presenters are, upon reviewing the H3 archival resource, what did you gain from it? What are aspects you want to highlight? What is missing from it? What might you add to the story? How might this archival resource be used to teach about political processes in Hawaii? And how do you see working with libraries and archives in terms of creating public history research? So before we get into each of the panelists, I wanted to provide a biography introduction to each person so that you can have some context on their background. Hold on a second. I think it's slideshow, right? Nope, it's not sharing, but I'll just read. Mahealani Cipher is a writer, editing professional, and public service advocate for the Native Hawaiian community as a Hawaiian cultural practitioner, owner of Native Knowledge LLC, former president of the Oahu Association of Hawaiian Civic Clubs, former president of the Ko'olau Poko Hawaiian Civic Club, and board member of Ko'olau Foundation. In 2017, she authored Distinguished Kama'aina of Kaneohebe Ko'olau Poko II, the people and history recognized by the Ko'olau Poko Hawaiian Civic Club 2011 to 2016. She was awarded the Frank Haynes Award for Lifetime Achievement by the Hawaii History Foundation in 2019. She helped to create the Ahupua'a Boundary Marker Project on the island of Oahu. She has advocated for Native rights and prevention of urban sprawl in the opposition to the construction of the Interstate H-3 Freeway. As a born and raised Kama'aina of Kaneohe, Cypher focuses on community planning and preservation of Hawaiian historic places such as Haiku Valley to benefit her family and all generations to come. Thomas S. Dye owned and operated an archaeological consultancy in Honolulu, T.S. Dye and Colleagues, archaeologists, from 2001 to 2018. Tom worked 6 years as Oahu Island archaeologist with the State Historic Preservation Division of the Department of Land and Natural Resources, where he was tasked with reviewing Bishop Museum H-3 archaeological reports. During his youth as a Kailua High School graduate, Tom was tasked with carrying out archaeological surveys ahead of the H-3. Tom publishes actively on Hawaiian archaeology and history and occasionally teaches archaeology courses at UH Manoa, where he is an affiliate graduate faculty member. Jennifer Sabas, a proud graduate of the University of Hawaii, worked for the U.S. Senator Daniel K. Inouye for more than 25 years in both Washington, D.C. and Honolulu, serving as his chief of staff until his passing in 2012. In early 2013, she established Kaimana Hila, a consulting practice supporting academic institutions and businesses. Her nonprofit work focuses on increasing cybersecurity awareness, support for rail and transit-oriented development, and the military sector. Jennifer is active in workforce development, creating career pathways in IT, cybersecurity, data science, intelligence, ship repair trades, and additive manufacturing, providing meaningful opportunities for Hawaii's young people to thrive at home. Kawena Komeiji is from Nu'uanu Kona, Oahu, with Ohana roots in the Waialua and Ko'olauloa Moku, though she currently resides in Honouliuli, Ewa, Oahu. Kawena has a bachelor's degree in Hawaiian Studies from Kamakakuokalani Center for Hawaiian Studies and a master's degree from the School of Library and Information Science at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. She is currently the Hawaii Pacific Resources Librarian in the James and Abigail Campbell Library at the University of Hawaii, West Oahu. Most recently, Kawena has been involved with archiving the online content of social and environmental justice movements in Hawaii. Let's begin in the order of the biographies I just shared. Mahealani, then Tom, then Jennifer, then Kawena. Let's begin.
Aloha mai kako. You here? How did I get involved in this? I'm not sure. In 1972, I was a news editor for the Sun Press community newspapers, which is when I first kind of learned more about H-3 Freeway. And I questioned, why are they making a fuss about it? It was controversial even at that time. And it's just a road. Why are they making a fuss? And then I started reading the stories that the reporters were bringing into the Sun Press, and I started reading the environmental impact statements. I read all 13 volumes. And then I read the EDA study, which is the Ekbo, Dean, Austin, and Williams socioeconomic study. And it troubled me deeply. And I started looking more closely at what did H-3 mean. And this archive really pulls a lot of that material in, not in the way I would do it, but it's a work of art. And I commend all of the archivists and the team that helped put this website together, because it's going to be really valuable. When H-3 was an issue in the 60s and 70s, it started off as a development issue, and the highway was going to be routed through all these different areas that didn't want the highway there. It's like development, anti-development. Then it evolved into an environmental issue. Halava Valley's pristine forests were going to be affected by the highway. And so there was an environmental battle going on at the same time. And finally, in the late 70s and 80s, it became a Hawaiian issue when Hawaiian sites were going to be affected. And so I'm kind of a naive, idealistic person. I was looking for honor all the way. And what I found in this highway development was honor failures. Honor failures by the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, who agreed to an MOA with federal agencies to allow the highway to proceed, even though a mitigation plan hadn't been completed and implemented. Honor failures by Bishop Museum in restricting what the archaeologists could talk about in their reports. They weren't allowed to talk about religious sites that they found. the firing of Barry Nakamura, who was a historian working on the project after sites were found and artifacts were found that were pretty valuable. Honor failures by DLNR, if you're talking about processes, the processes are all listed very well, from the federal down to the county. There was a county involvement too, where Mayor Fossey was involved at one time when he had a funeral for H3. So all those kinds of things happened. But this archive could use a little bit more balance. The overall story could use a little bit more explanation of why people were opposed. I don't think that's clear enough. It wasn't just opposition. It was advocacy for things that were important. They wanted to protect the windward side from being overdeveloped, because studies show that highways bring development. And so windward side was really concerned about. That was got me involved first, because I'm a windward resident and I was worried about impact on the windward side. So I wanted to see more balance. So I'm hoping that this is a work in progress, that as more information is obtained, it'd be added to the site. I know there were like 17 cases that I had gathered from different people, including the EIS and including some of Boyce Brown's, our attorney, his records. And so once we can get them into the hands of the team, then you folks might be able to add it to the project. What's missing? I'm talking about the things that I found were kind of important. The EDOS study was very important because it predicted what kinds of socioeconomic impacts would happen to the windward communities. And many of those impacts have occurred. The elderly people are having a hard time paying their taxes because their cost of living is higher now on the windward side because it's more urbanized. There are domestic failures. The families are having challenges and problems with more urbanization. So the urbanization has had its impact. So the socioeconomic impact is being felt. The failure of 106. 106 is the National Historic Preservation Act that requires that federally involved projects have to address adverse impacts upon cultural and religious or historic sites. And they have not, to this day, mitigated the impact of H3 on Haiku Valley. And I'm disappointed that the impact in Haiku and Halava, Kukuiokani, and Luluku is not really being mitigated adequately, but might be too late to fix all those things. But as part of the Ko'olau Foundation, which was formed in late 90s when the highway was about to be opened, it's the former Stop H3 Association. And we changed the mission from fighting a highway to advocating for historic preservation. And so Ko'olau Foundation is committed to that. And we do that mostly in Haiku now. We are working to establish a culture preserve. And we have recently, worked out an agreement with the Department of Hawaiian Homes so that we can move forward on that. And so we're working on a master plan for that right now. We still think the mitigation is owed by the federal government and the state. It's a 90 and on a 90-10 share, so that most of it is federal money. And so we continue to ask for that mitigation. Again, it's an honor failure. I'm talking about honor failures throughout the whole history. The congressional exemption from 4F, as was mentioned earlier by one of the speakers, when they exempted the impact of H3 on the Pali Golf Course and Ho'omaluhia, it was a congressional exemption. It was pretty big. It was the first time ever. And what it did was open the door for other exemptions in other places across the continent. And it did allow other cultural areas to be adversely affected and environmental areas that were affected. So 4F exemption did have an impact and still today is a problem. It kind of takes the teeth out of 4F somewhat. The Native Hawaiian culture concerns were not handled as good as they could have been. There was a lot of, I felt, manipulation. So the honor failure there, but had to do with some people at OHA manipulating the kupuna that were advocating for the preservation of a cultural site in Halava Valley. And that to me was an honor failure. So how can we learn from this archive about what to do better in the future? So I'm thinking we can learn from what worked, what needs improvement, such as maybe improving the dialogue between project advocates and those with concerns about the project. maybe it would be nice if OHA would pay better attention to Hawaiian concerns that are raised regarding all the different projects and not just their pet projects. But we love OHA. We just think that they could do better. There were several times when the highway was rerouted. Now that is a tricky word, that phrase, rerouted, seems supposedly to save sites, actually never saved anything. It was just words. So I was involved with Kukuyokani, and it is a heiau that the highway goes through the middle of here in Kaneohe alongside Likiliki Highway. And that was not really rerouted. It goes through the heart, the middle, the pico of the freeway. Was rerouted in Halawa to save the what do you call it, the Haleopapa and the Luakini complex. It goes through the middle. So it's not really rerouted. But, you know, I understand that the project advocates were doing what they thought was best. I think it was mostly a make work project in the beginning to bring in support from the business community, and totally understood that's process too. You know, that is process. But as a community person, I would have wanted better honor along the whole way. And idealistically, it's not going to happen, but that's what I was all about. And I still love all the people that I worked with and the people that I fought with. I even, you know, there were people that that were on the other side of the fence, like the plumbers union. And we did a protest once outside of Senator Inouye's campaign headquarters. And they brought down like 200 plumber apprentices to protest against us, you know, to protest in favor of the freeway. And we were there with an opponent opposing the freeway. And I think we outlasted them because they left after a while. But years later, the plumbers union president or business manager was being appointed to a board of water supply where I was working. And I was asked to help get support for him to be appointed by the council, to be confirmed by the council. I had actually worked with this guy on another project regarding getting plumbers to help install water-saving toilets for elderly people. And so he was all for helping with that. And because of that, we decided to get support. So we got several of our employees from Board of Water Supply to go to council, first time ever happened. And we worked to get him confirmed by the council, and he was confirmed. And so good things can happen. And I learned a lot from, his name was Chubby. Yeah, Kaupua. Yeah, he was really good. And I actually went out to see his training unit out at Pearl City somewhere. And he taught me that they guarantee the work of every employee. Now, if we could have that done by every union, that would be so great. But anyway, that's beside the point. The honor failures are what my biggest message is today. And I admire all of the work that everybody on this table does and everybody in the archive team did. And I hope that they keep it open so that more information can be added. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'd like to thank Ellen for the introduction, and thank you for being here today. I'm very happy to be here with you. I hope to share some of my experiences in the political processes around H-3 archaeology. There we go. Hence the title of my slideshow, H-3 Archives and Political Processes Archaeology. Before I start, in the interest of full disclosure, my wife, Dory, who you met earlier today, is one of the librarians responsible for this. But I want you to know that when I praise this project, it's not because I'm trying to smooth things in the home front. I'm speaking from my heart. And at the same time, if I say some things that you take as critical of these efforts, please don't view them that way. Please view them as my attempt to be collaborative on a project that I see being a really wonderful collaborative project. Slide, yeah. Okay, at the start, I'd like to make a few comments about the website, which you see here. And I want to call your attention to the menu between the header and the horizontal white line. And I really admire all the work that was put into to create these different views. There's that overview that Dory showed you. My favorite is the timeline. I think that's a terrific tool. And the really important part for me is this middle one, which is the processes, the classification processes that are really central to the project and to the use of the website. There's a list of collections where where archival materials might be found. This is going to be super helpful to researchers. And then there's a list of the top 10 parties that were involved in the H-3 political process. Next one. I'm really a fan of this because I believe that classification is a very essential step in creating knowledge. And the 7 processes you see here listed can be used to filter the timeline, which makes it possible to put a process that interests you into its historical context. Now, I've published some historical research which involved a whole lot of really tedious work making a timeline and then setting timelines up, trying to correlate what was going on. And that's pretty much done for you right here. And so I really see this as a tremendous research tool for historians. If instead of typing one of these processes into the timeline, you actually follow it, you find a wealth of potentially useful information. Here I followed the regulatory process. I scrolled past miles of screen real estate given over to the EIS process that was the focus of so much legal wrangling back in the day, and found the regulatory framework for archaeology. Now, Maheilani's mentioned the National Historic Preservation Act, which in its 106th section mandates historic preservation review for projects that involve the federal government. And here in Hawaii, this historic preservation review is carried out by the State Historic Preservation Division. I've drawn an ellipse around the sentence that highlights the role played by the Pohaku Kaluahine site in the redesign that rerouted H-3 through North Halava Valley rather than Wanalua Valley. Okay, I want now just to do a brief comparison to compare the Archives and Political Processes website with some other ways you might choose to learn about the political processes around H-3. If you type H-3 into the Hamilton Library finding aid, I don't know if you can see those, but only the second of the first 4 hits is about the highway. The first and third hits are about interstellar H-3, and one hopes those aren't about the highway. The fourth hit is remarkable. You probably can't read it. It's difficult to read anyway. Its audience is a bunch of chemists. And I had to search for a word in that title that I understood, because the chemists have invented their own language to describe the work that they do. But my point here is that a library catalog search is likely to yield a broad range of extraneous information. And that result contrasts really starkly with the focus of the Archives and Political Processes website. Now, if you're a bookworm like me, then you might also use the footnotes of history books as finding aids. These share the focus of Archives and Political Processes, but they differ by pointing out a particular point of view. And this, I think, contrasts very strongly with the multivocality of the Archives and Political Processes website. Okay, now I'm going to turn away from the website itself to talk a little bit about my experience in the actual political process of the H-3 archaeology. Now, if I understand correctly, I'm not a political scientist, but political processes are the interface between makers and administrators of policy on the one hand, and the people whose lives are impacted by policy on the other. Now, for a while in the 1990s, I was one of the state bureaucrats responsible for administering historic preservation policies during construction of H3. And the quote on the slide that you see is what the state legislature hoped for the policy I administered. So you see, it talks about the Constitution of the state of Hawaii. And then the really important part of it is to promote the use of such historic properties for the education, inspiration, pleasure, and enrichment of its citizens. Okay, now I'm going to refer to this as I go through as the legislative intent or the legislature's intent. Now when I joined SHPD in the early 1990s, I thought the presence of historic sites might stop a construction project. After all, the Stop H3 Association had stopped the Moana Valley H3 route, in part because of historic properties such as Pohaku Kaluahine. During my SHPD training, the National Park Service instructor guided us through the complex Section 106 review process with this flowchart. I was astonished to realize that every path through the flowchart ends at project proceeds. A site such as Pohaku Kaluahine, a highway such as H3 might be rerouted or redesigned to preserve a site such as Pohaku Kaluahine, but the highway would be built regardless. Many of the public conversations around H3 archaeology were about finding a way to stop the highway rather than the legislature's intent that these conversations educate, inspire, enrich, and give pleasure to its citizens. I want to bring your attention to this remarkable book for two reasons, apart from its stunning photographs. One is a quote from my SHPD supervisor, Ross Cordy. This is his quote: "H3 is a good lesson in how not to do historic preservation. We were literally following the bulldozers to see what they might turn up. It was appalling." Another reason is that this book includes a timeline that documents how Bishop Museum's archaeology program stepped into this difficult situation and crumbled under the weight of what was then the most expensive archaeology project ever carried out in the state. In my oversight position at SHPD, I witnessed firsthand the demise of the state's oldest and most prestigious archaeology program at Bishop Museum. This is a storyline that, in my opinion, comes through much more strongly in Eluku Vale'e than it does in the timeline of the Archives and Political Processes website. When I went to work at SHPD, not only was there intense public opposition to the highway, but Bishop Museum archaeologists were being severely criticized in the press. Scott Williams' inquiry that led him eventually to understand that Kukui'o Kanehiea would be buried by H3 construction is sometimes portrayed as a cover-up that enabled the Federal Highways Administration and the Hawaii Department of Transportation to avoid redesigning the highway. Many were livid, justifiably so, that the testimony of local Hawaiians about Kukui'o Kane was questioned and largely ignored. Now, I respect Scott. He's a fellow Kailua High School graduate. And I think he was assigned the almost impossible task of using archaeology to identify the physical remains of the heiau. It had been known for a long time that the heiau was destroyed, this is the word used in the document, when it was plowed up by the Libby pineapple plantation. In the 1930s, Bishop Museum archaeologist J. Gilbert McAllister, reported that the old Hawaiians of the district told him that on account of this plowing, a disease attacked their pineapples and the undertaking was a failure. When Scott got into the field, he had no way to know that many of the sites that were in use when Kukui'o Kane was built were now deeply buried. The Windward Oahu landscape had been transformed after immigrants introduced sheep, goats, and cattle, which ate the native forest and initiated a cycle of erosion that buried many sites. This situation, where some sites are plowed and others are deeply buried, is an archaeologist's nightmare. By the end of the H3 project, as many buried sites had been exposed by the bulldozers as the archaeologists had recorded on the surface. In this situation, it is hard to see how the information from an archaeological investigation might confirm or refute local testimony. In any case, Scott's archaeological investigations didn't shed much light one way or the other. Before we leave this slide, note that when this report was issued in 2009, Scott had been living and working in the Northwest Coast for several years, and the report was put together by this long list of co-authors that you see here. And this is a sign of turnover in Bishop Museum's archaeology program as it crumbled under the weight of the H3 project. Next. Before I give you my take on the demise of Bishop Museum archaeology, I want to describe two successful scientific, 3 minutes, okay, I'm gonna do it, research programs so we can get a handle on the conditions that drive good science. In my view, science isn't just what scientists do or the body of knowledge gained through scientific inquiry. Rather, I subscribe to the view that science is the protocol required for collaborative, curiosity-driven inquiry. Such a protocol needs a language that facilitates communications of observations with colleagues and with future generations of inquirers, because many scientific research programs work for generations to achieve their goals. And we saw one of these with that chemistry article on the UH website. Now, when sweet potato, or uwala, was introduced to Hawaii from South America a couple of centuries after Polynesians discovered and settled our islands, Hawaiian farmers began experimenting with this cultivation and selecting cultivars that did best in particular situations, eventually making all the land shown here in green potentially productive sweet potato fields. We can measure the success of the Uwala Scientific Research Program by noting that sweet potato is great pig food, and that when Captain Cook visited in 1778 and 1779, he and his crew reported that Hawaiian pig herds were by far the largest they had encountered in their travels throughout the Pacific. The 230 odd names for sweet potato varieties cataloged by the Handies with Mrs. Pukui's help in the 1930s constitute a part of the language Hawaiian scientists developed to achieve this remarkable result. Another characteristic of the protocol for scientific inquiry is that it is best employed by a community that shares a sense of which questions are most important and which among them will prove feasible to answer, so that progress toward program goals can be optimized. The fish ponds at either end of H3 at Pu'uloa and Kaneohe document Hawaiian independent invention of aquaculture, an accomplishment that is inconceivable without the kind of scientific research program I've described. In both these cases, Hawaiian culture's attention to tradition and to passing knowledge from one generation to the next contributes strongly to success. Next. Unfortunately, the Hawaiian values that contributed so strongly to the success of the Uwala and local research programs were not operative at Bishop Museum. This front page story from the Honolulu Star Bulletin on October 3rd, 1991 reports the first round of archaeology staff layoffs at Bishop Museum. The newspaper story scratches the surface of the acrimony. If I remember correctly, these two archaeologists arrived at work one day to find their offices locked and their computers confiscated. Soon after, the archaeologist in charge of the North Halava Valley fieldwork left Bishop Museum too. In their place, Bishop Museum brought in new hires from the mainland with no experience here in Hawaii. In my position with SHPD, I tried to bring the old crew together with the new one so the negative effects of this break in the archaeology research program might be mitigated, but the situation at Bishop Museum was so toxic that it proved impossible. To their credit, several of the newcomers were technically sound archaeologists, and they managed to produce reports that met minimal standards. Nevertheless, in my opinion, the break in the archaeology research program was too much to overcome, and the products of H3 archaeology fell short of the legislature's intent. Last slide. I'd like to wrap up my presentation on a positive note with three observations. First, community groups such as Ko'olau Foundation are making use of some of the sites that survive freeway construction. You've heard about Mahealani leading the librarians on a tour of Haiku, and I learned through the Archives of Political Processes website that the Paikuli Stride Ohana is involved in a project to reestablish Lo'ikalo in some of the Luluku terraces. The efforts of these people help realize the legislature's intent. Second, and somewhat ironically, the book I showed earlier, E Lupu Wale'e, also realizes the legislature's intent, but it does so by focusing on the destruction of historic sites rather than their preservation. Finally, we now have the Archives and Political Processes website, which offers sophisticated finding aids and links to much of the information needed to make sense of the many failed political processes around the H-3 project. It's my hope that the website will also support more positive outcomes along the lines I've tried to indicate today. Anaho.
Thank you. I thought long and hard. So as you heard from my introduction, I had a great honor to be able to work both. So I live in Kaneohe. I live so I was at home and I came here right like 5 minutes before tea time. But an amazing honor to be able to work in Washington, D.C. and in Hawaii, and being able to travel back and forth and be part of so much of what went on in Hawaii. But I did think a lot about what I wanted to share today, and I'm going to end it but put it in context, right? That we live in such tumultuous times in Hawaii, and for sure in our nation's capital. And divisiveness and protest, that's nothing new. I chuckle and I sit next to my friend working for Senator Inouye. We were used to it. We had probably more than our share of being picketed, swore upon, cussed out. I was a supervising staff member for the completion of H-3. And I was part of the legislative team that worked to return Kaho'olawe to the people of Hawaii. And I do want to say that nobody is ever happy in a controversial project. And even if you think you win, you never, ever do. It never ever comes out as you would hope it would. And I want to start by saying that I think you all did an outstanding job in laying out the history and the timeline. It did provide for me a no kidding, sometimes PTSD walk down memory lane. And it definitely refreshed my recollection. But it did provide for me, at a way more policy level, a very clearly laid out, transparent for open review. And your selection of H-3, and I think Dawn was a little, cautious when she asked me, but I do think that H-3 provided the perfect test case, right? Because it involved all levels of our government, our legislature, our executive branch, as well as the judicial. And it also included all levels of government, our county, our state, and our federal. And of course, right, a very active and passionate community throughout. Right, this project spanned 3 decades and 4 governors, 1965 to 1997. And by the time I joined the staff in 1987, the very controversial exemption, as Mihaleni mentioned, right, that exemption of the requirement, the 4F requirement for the public park had recently been passed and signed into law by then President Reagan. So I'm on staff. I think to myself, right, little did I know that my turn was coming, right, in this decade-long initiative. So in 1992, right, as was already mentioned, it was uncovered, right, the Haleopapa, or the Women's Temple. And there were pickets and marches, and I still remember getting ready to come home with the senator for a visit and trying to be as prepared as we could, knowing it was going to be an incredibly rough ride when we were here. But in the space of several months in 1992, while we were picketed and protested, and also included that picket that she talked about in 1992, it also included a very passionate sit-in in our Honolulu office, led by now our friend Lily Kala and Jim Anthony. And it was kind of traumatizing, can I say, at the time, but when I reflect back on it and I think about it, right, it was very passionate. It was some tough talk, some rough talk going on, but it also then gave the senator, I think, the focus and the understanding that right? They did need to do something. And Mihalani mentioned that, it wasn't good enough, but that there was that decision, and it happened immediately after that sit-in, that he was going to do what he needed to do to get that highway realigned. And I was going to do what I needed to do, was to find $80 million to allow for that realignment. And I say to you that it was a very unhappy compromise, but it was a compromise. Those who opposed H3 wanted it to stop and wanted that project to stop, but it was already in very active constructing from two ends, and the highway was going to be completed. The state of Hawaii was incredibly upset with us because they did not want to realign it and they did not want to redesign it. And of course, the federal government was also very unhappy because they would need now to go find additional resources to make the alignment happen. And that was the marking of the final compromise, if you want to call it that. And the highway opened in 1997. So when you think about it, H3 has been open for more than 25 years and has provided the Windward Oahu residents a third option to get to town. And for those that have been born after 1987, many have no sense or have no thought, especially if you live on the Windward side, a life without H3, unless you've heard it right around the kitchen table, or you've taken a poli-sci class, right? And so I think that this website that provides this historical accounting, and I think very balanced. I mean, I thought it was balanced. I thought it was very comprehensive, to give those that whether they're in college or not, to give them a very broad view about what happened, the good and the bad. And so I'm also very interested in what UH's next project will be, kind of going forward. And so, when I talk to young leaders, young aspiring leaders, I do share a lot of experiences, and I include H3 in that experience and the lessons that I learned. Because when I talk about leadership, I talk about navigating, keeping conversations going, even if there are times when you really, really don't want to hear it. I mean, like, nobody wants to be picketed or yelled at or spit at. But when you step back and you think, and you step back and you take some solace and you keep your ears open, that oftentimes those voices have truth. And those voices at times will bruise your conscience. And what I tell aspiring young legislators in particular is, it's what you do then that makes you a leader. Do you lean in? Do you course correct, or at least think about a course correct? Do you at least pause to think about who is sitting on the other side and think about what it means to be walking in their slippers before you move on? And as I said up front, right, these are some very tumultuous times, and there's this sense, and I'm hoping that Kavena talks about, and there's this sense, right, in our younger generations, right, that the places we cherish are no longer for us. The values that matter to us maybe are not universally shared, and that this sense of loss and sadness can easily be translated into anger, and that's what we see, I think, in many occasions. And so even if we think that's partially true, that we as a community need to think about how we chart that path forward, and it may be smaller steps, slower steps, and it may be with more groups willing to share more and take less. And so for this reason, I think that this project and all the work that went into standing it up and picking probably one of the most controversial projects that you could have picked, I think it's awesome. I think it's game on time. I think it provides the next gen and those that think about it, because I thought it was very comprehensive. It was very transparent. And I think it's inviting, because, right, as many smart people have said, right, history is only as good as our ability to accept it and to learn the lessons. Otherwise, we're going to repeat them again. And so I hope this H3 test case and this broader website are the first in many to provide this to provide for lessons learned, historic and current going forward. Because I really do believe that learning from history strengthens the strength or the fabric of our community and our democracy. And I do think it's incumbent on all of us to chart a path that allows the sun to shine on everyone. So thank you.
Oh, it's working. Is it working? Aloha, my name is Kavana. I am the Hawaii Pacific Resources Librarian at UH West Oahu. To be honest, when I first came, I wasn't sure what I was going to talk about. But like after hearing everybody today and you folks too in the beginning, I think I'm here because I have two kulana. So my first one, and I always prioritize this, I'm always going to be an aloha aina. So this comes before me being a librarian, me being, active in my community. Aloha aina is what really guides me and leads me to making decisions. And so as aloha aina, when I look at a resource like the website, it sort of it helps me to understand how this history of mismanagement that I think Tom and Mahealani, you guys talked about a lot, has laid the foundation for us in this generation to move forward and push back on projects we don't agree with, projects we don't necessarily want for our communities. And so being able to see it, especially in the timeline form, I think really drives that point home, that the fact that it took this long to come up with all of these reports and that there were so many sidesteppings. And I had a conversation with one of our instructors, Ross Cordy, before this presentation, and he agreed that this mismanagement of this project laid a solid foundation for us today with Kukia Imauna and shut down Red Hill. For us in Ewa, it's the Honokea Surf Park that I think is very similar. Similar to the H-3. It's not as big as H-3, but I think that Stop H-3 really helped us, like in my generation and your guys' generation now, which is weird to say, but it's really helped our generation to understand these political processes, because I was telling everybody earlier that, coming from Hawaiian studies, I think it's just ingrained in us to understand these. I mean, when Lily Kala is your teacher, it's ingrained in you to understand these political processes. But for the everyday person, like my Kane and my husband, he doesn't understand these processes. And so to have a website like this kind of lay it out for him so that he can understand, like, this is what's supposed to happen and this is what happens. I think Auntie Jen, you said it kind of fires people up of like, especially as Hawaiians, because we're always expected to give, we're always the ones having to move aside, step aside, and give away our culture and our land for the greater good, and so I think with like projects like this, it kind of shows how much was given and why we in this generation don't want to give anymore. And like you said, it kind of makes that anger, right? It's that generational anger. But as a librarian, I think what this website shows too is the power of community. And so in our field in particular, I think that there's been a shift in, rather than just making library collections or archives collections where we just collect everything and hoard it and lock it away in the vault, like we're moving more towards being community driven and land driven. Kilohi, you said this earlier too, that there's a shift, I think, in the library field, at least in Hawaii, to move it from being just becoming these repositories, but actually letting it be driven by community. Like, I didn't know you folks went out up to Haiku, and like I think that's so cool because you never hear about librarians. You don't hear about librarians going out and hiking and like understanding, okay, not going on a hike, but to really understand the collections that we have. And that's, for me as a librarian, that's what I'm trying to do with Ewa. Like, I have no ties to Ewa other than I live there now and I've been working there for a long time. But you make that effort to get to know the land because that's how you get to know the people. That's how you get to know everything else that follows. And so I think that this whole idea of like community archives and having our community members actually be the archivists and help to shape the archives is really cool. And so there's a couple projects that I'm working on right now that actually do that. And so One is we're trying to archive the social media coming out of Pukia Imauna, which we hope will set up some sort of workflow and, you know, some kind of instruction that we can then implement into other environmental and social justice movements, especially in Hawaii. Right now, we're also doing the Lahaina fires because there's just so much, and I don't think anybody's saving this. And again, we're not doing this for us because we can just go on Instagram or Facebook right now and like look up the post, but we're doing it for the future generations so that the future generations don't have to go back. I mean, I love you folks for doing that, but like, you know, you have to go back 20, 30 years into the archives and pull out all this stuff for the website. But we're hoping that, you know, by deploying this, it's called like rapid response archiving, I think, that will be able to save all of this stuff while it's happening and, you know, really build up our community and empower our communities to do it themselves so that they can see what libraries and archives, you know, that they can see the library and archives as a place where they belong. Because as Kelohi said, to be Hawaiian in Hawaii is to be political. And there are two things that scare Hawaiians, which is the government and libraries and archives, which is why I went into libraries and archives, because I never felt comfortable there. So to switch that sort of mentality from being this red tape building, this brick building where you can't go in, to, oh, my mom or my grandma helped build this archive, it really kind of shifts. And so that's what I mahalo about this project, is that there is community involved and like you folks actually went out to that place, and like that's just really awesome, I think, to me. So sorry, that was a little ramble, but like there's so many things going on because I'm like just very inspired by everybody today. But mahalo.
Thank you, panelists, for sharing your insights and feedback on our resource. We really appreciate it. I think we're taking it all in and thinking about your comments. So now I do want to move to the Q&A section. I want to move to the Q&A section, and so I want to invite people in person and online. First, you want to stretch, grab some snacks, you know, shake a leg a little bit. But we are just going to roll on up to the Q&A, and I'm going to call Dory to do the facilitation. And so, Dory, are you ready? Okay, I'll bring the mic to you. So this is all panelists, part 1 and 2 panelists will be asked questions and open for everyone's discussion.
Thank you. Is the owl spinning around?
Yeah.
Can the owl see me? I want the owl to see me. Okay, so okay, now we're going. So again, I'll repeat the request that folks on Zoom who have questions, submit them into the Q&A. We're going to be flipping back and forth between the room, which has winnowed down quite a bit, the Zoom, and then we also have some questions that were submitted beforehand with the RSVPs. So let's get started. The first question is for me as your moderator for our second panel. Panelists, do you have a question that you would like to ask other panelists?
I have a comment for Kavena. I'm actually really excited that you guys are starting to collect the social media part, because I think that is the next gen and how that all fits together, but that you're doing it for the Lahaina. I think that's really valuable. Yeah. I mean, I think it's both healing as well as being able to use it kind of concurrently, as they start to rebuild and start to think of what tomorrow looks like. That's awesome. That's terrific.
Oh, yeah, we're trying to again let this be community led, so we're working with UH Maui on getting that what the scope of that looks like, because as everybody knows, there's a lot of crazy things on the internet, especially now, and especially with the fires. And so we're trying to come up with our process and trying to figure out our scope and what we would like to include, what we want to archive versus maybe what we don't, but then also trying to figure out we want to hear, we
wanna
want
get
there to
some,
be a
yeah.
rounded sort of thing. And so we're still figuring that out, but we're trying.
I think it's wonderful. I think that's going to be very helpful.
You guys have anything else? Okay. Let's go to a question submitted earlier. And I'll preface this question by saying that we did this project to, number one, help researchers, and number two, to promote civic engagement. And for this question, I want to focus on that second purpose. The question is, what political concepts or processes are most important for people to understand as civically engaged citizens? Another way to ask this question is, Mahelani or Kavena, where do you think you were most successful in any of your advocacy work? Jennifer or Tom, through what processes do you think people either against or for the H-3 project were most effective? I'll let you guys duke it out over who starts first.
Is it okay now? Okay. What was most successful? I don't know. I spent 50 years being involved with H3 in various ways, starting with the Sun Press and now working on a cultural site in Haiku Valley. Maybe never giving up is one of the successes. I continue to enjoy sharing the stories of the place and maybe of H3 sometimes. I don't talk about it unless the group asks for it. But what I do when I'm talking to young people, especially, because every person's an archive and every family has an archive of their own family heritage. So I advise them all to talk to their elders and get their stories. So that's one thing we hope has been successful, that we encourage young people to collect their family heritage, their family archive from the elders in their family. So that's all I can say.
Mahalo.
Question was about. Okay. The question was about which part of the opposition was most successful. In my experience, the occupation of North Halava Valley was incredibly successful. Jennifer's talked a bit about the money she had to raise to get the DOT transportation engineers to redesign that part of the highway. And I sat in the room as they were talking about doing this, and you're absolutely right. They didn't want to do it. I mean, that's stating it very mildly. They didn't want to do that, but they did. They raised the highway up there, and I'm sure that didn't satisfy anybody. The engineers were really salty about it, and the opposition, the folks who had occupied the valley, weren't happy with it either, because as Mahalani said, it still cuts right through the site. I mean, on one side you have
One side is a women's side.
Yeah, there's one side, there's the women's side, and then there's the men's side, and it kind of, the highway goes right there. So I don't think anybody was happy about the outcome, but talk about success. I mean, I tried to get the DOT guys to do a bunch of stuff, and I wasn't very successful. Certainly not as successful as the folks who occupied the valley.
I would add that I think because of the span, right? Right. So you had different governors. You had there was so much that the opposition did a pretty darn good job in because different governors, different mayors, they all had different positioning. Right, it was ups and downs, and I mean they did a pretty terrific job. And I know, right, I mean Senator was strung up in effigy because he did the legislation, but right, was ahead of my time. But he was incredibly annoyed at having to do it because they failed locally. They should have been able to figure this out. And so by the time they're desperate, they're up on Capitol Hill. and right, the rest is kind of history. But it was, but the opposition did an incredibly terrific job. I mean, they worked the court system, and they did a really amazing job in the extent to which you all were organized. You know,
We did get a negative story in the Washington Post. Not
Yeah.
about us, but about the bill sponsor.
Yes. Oh, trust me. I'm sure.
I think for me, I don't think, well, I think we all measure success differently, and a lot of like this issues that I advocate for are still unresolved, like they're still actually in action. But I think for me, what success looks like is a thriving community, and a community who is engaged in these processes, who understand, you know, what we have to do, and that we do it, and we do it together. So to me, that's what success looks like.
Okay, thank you. We have some questions from Zoom. This is from Kealohi's fan club. There are two questions. Number one, how did you decide what to include in the database? I guess what motivated your choices for what images to take when you were doing the repository reviews? The second question is, can you share more about the project that you facilitated? So I think that's the artwork. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you all for asking those questions, Zoom people. I'm looking right at the owl. Hopefully you guys see me. For the scanning documents, there were so many that I went through, but the ones that caught my eye the most were ones that had photos on them, because I'm a visual person for sure. And I want to see like the faces of the people who were involved, the layouts, how everything looked, what the island looked like before they put down the H-3. All of that was really interesting to me. And when I was reading through the documents, anything that had a very strong emotional writing, I feel I was very attracted to. Stuff that I could see people's voice coming through, documents that I also saw on the government side, where they would say very discrediting things, because that would get an emotional reaction out of me and I'd get upset. Like I found myself being so upset at times going through some government boxes and just seeing them say, oh, not enough evidence to support this claim of Hawaiian knowledge. And I was like, oh, okay. I want to contest that, but of course this happened 40, 30 years ago. So all I can do is sit here and take a picture of it and show everyone else what it is that I'm seeing that makes me so upset. And so that ties into the workshop as well, because these were the documents that I brought forth, some things that brought that emotional reaction out of me. I realized had the same reaction for a lot of the folks who were reading through them, because it was a lot of people's first time actually seeing these documents, working with archival documents before. And so there's a period where, you know, we had our talk story at the beginning going over the history and people sharing, you know, some people's grandparents were involved in the construction of it. We had really amazing kumu who were there too, and just folks who all had different perspectives, but ultimately were able to channel that emotion into their artwork. And so we took about 10 minutes and people were reading through the documents, you know, exchanging with one another, looking at what other people have. I really also enjoyed the correspondence. I think that made some beautiful artwork too, because seeing what people sent in advocating for the land really reminded me that, you know, these are actual people who are living, breathing, you know, some who have passed away. There were some attendants who actually read it and they said, hey, this is my grandma, or this is my auntie who sent this in. And so that was amazing to just see the connection that these are still relevant stories that are alive. And once we get to see these documents, we can really form that connection and personal connection to the issues and to continue fighting.
From the room, is there anybody who has a question? If anybody's stirred up. I love panel 2, by the way. We'll go back to Zoom. And this question is for all. It says, can the panelists speak to the military occupation and expansion of militarism in the Pacific in the H-3 context? What are the lessons learned from this context? I'm going to read it again because I haven't wrapped my head around that one. Can the panelists speak to the military occupation and expansion of militarism in the Pacific in the H-3 context? What are the lessons learned from this context? Any of the panelists who feel like they can take that on?
Well, I give it a shot, but really Jen would be better at it, but I don't think she was involved at the time. It was the justification for building the highway initially was to connect the two bases from Mokapu to Pearl Harbor. And that remained the purpose clause for the funding over the years. Eventually it expanded to improving transportation. So, but I don't think it was a big military issue. We didn't have people fighting it because they didn't like the military.
You can pass.
Yeah, I'm gonna pass. I don't get, yeah.
That was the first early 60s.
Yeah, that was another question that came in earlier. And it says, from today's perspective, was there any actual military necessity for this road at that time? So I guess, I don't know if others have thoughts on that other than Mahealani.
No, what she said is exactly correct. I mean,
Okay.
it started as the federal justification, but ultimately it was not. I mean, it went beyond that.
I have another question from Zoom, and well, the question from Zoom is really similar to a series of questions that were submitted earlier, and I want to go to that earlier set of questions because I wrote them up. And this question I want to direct to Kealohi, Kyle, and Perry, who at the moment all seem possibly headed towards careers in public service, whether in libraries and archives or in some other capacity. So this is a stack of questions. So hold on. Okay. What is the role of archives and library staff to help the public engage with some of the controversial issues associated with building the H-3 freeway? For example, quote, the state built the Kaneohe interchange on top of sacred sites, including the site of Kukuyo Kane, close quote. Or the controversial participation of Senator Daniel Inouye in pushing through the building of the project, even though he said in regard to H-3, quote, every conceivable step is taken to study the area involved to make certain that sacred sites are not desecrated or placed in jeopardy, close quote. How can libraries and archives help facilitate conversations that make some people very uncomfortable, so they would rather not discuss them? What is the ethical obligation of libraries and archive staff to engage with these issues that have been taken up in some universities, museums, and cultural institutions that deal with issues raised by Indigenous communities about the colonial settler state and its practices? I'm going to read the questions again. What is the role of archives and library staff to help the public engage with some of the controversial issues associated with building the H-3 freeway? How can libraries and archives help facilitate conversations that make some people very uncomfortable, and so they would rather not discuss them? And the last question, what is the ethical obligation of libraries and archive staff to engage with these issues that have been taken up in some universities, museums, and cultural institutions that deal with issues raised by Indigenous communities about the colonial settler state and its practices? What is the role of archives and library staff to help the public engage with some of the controversial issues associated with building the H-3 freeway? And I should also say that I directed this question to the three of you in particular because these two, Kealohi and Kyle, are very likely to pursue careers in libraries and have plans to attend a library school after this project.
Okay, so as as I talked about earlier, I came out of Kamakua Kolani, and so my initial reaction to any kind of Western Western intrusion, whether it's like physical or otherwise, is to burn it all down. So coming into this, that's kind of the mindset that I came in with. They told me to put graphics on the background on the web page, and I was like, I think I put something like institutional colonialism at its finest, and they're like, Kyle, that's a little heavy-handed. Let's pull it back. So I think that in that moment, I know it's funny to talk about, but I think in that moment, I kind of had to pull myself back and realize, like, as we go into this, trying to create a research tool, you spoke to balance earlier. You said we had done a good job of creating balance on this resource that we had created, and I think that that balance is, that speaks to our credibility. So even though we obviously lean one way or another, I think it's definitely one of our paramount responsibilities to make sure all the information is out there, because as soon as you start like tucking information back in the corners, trying to hide it away, I think you lose your credibility. So even as hard as it may be, especially with the H-3 project, or like most of the things that are most situations that are sensitive here in Hawaii, given the context of politics and stuff, I just think it's important that we put the whole story out there. Yeah, we need to, yeah.
I appreciate you saying that, and knowing that was kind of the first layout for the website. I would have loved to see that in the background, not gonna lie. But I do think that it is an ethical obligation of librarians and archivists to make the information accessible to the public, and not just for university staff or for students, for people out in the community who are just interested. That was one thing that I was talking about with my partner, who was watching this right now and looking at the website, was not affiliated with UH in any way, was like, wow, this is actually super accessible. And I feel like I've learned so much from just looking at it without feeling like, I have to be a part of like the school, it's only available to UH systems. So being able to share that and having sessions like this, even beyond schools, it's great that it's hosted here. And that there's a lot of promo across UH systems, so tune in on Zoom and whatnot. But it'd be great to have this session out like somewhere else, somewhere that more people can engage with it and just continue to utilize these resources. And so I would also encourage to have more creative ones. I think people love to create things. As we've seen with the artwork, people just jumped at the opportunity, and most people were kind of like, what is this workshop? What exactly are we doing here? But then once they start to really like learn and do a haptic type of art, so haptic, like using your hands and creating something, it gives you a sense of ownership as well, and that connection that I was speaking to earlier. I think there's just so many ways that archives can evolve and continue to fulfill that ethical obligation to provide that to the general public.
If I had more time, I feel like that's like an essay prompt. I don't know why, but when I heard those questions, I thought of something that's on my desk at work. It's a report that was issued by the Hawaii Executive Collaborative, I believe in the last year, before the fires in Maui. But it discussed 4 possible futures for the state of Hawaii, for the Hawaiian archipelago. And it made me think of when I first saw this report come out, I thought back to the state's preamble, and the fact that one of the authors of the preamble recently passed away, and there wasn't a lot of attention to his passing, and that got me in turn thinking about how so I went through our public school system, and frankly, our public school system doesn't do a very good job teaching civics education, teaching government, teaching people to comprehend the place they inhabit, so that when people graduate from high school, they'll enter society here in Hawaii, and they won't understand a lot of the processes. They won't understand the legislature. They don't know how many legislators there are. They don't know that we have a House and a Senate. They'll be like, wait a minute, isn't that the US Congress? There's a lot of a lot of ignorance, and I think that's very tragic. And so when we talk about the role of archives in societies, I think archives need a lot more love and they need a lot more support. And we need a lot more critical engagement going both ways between the people with the means and the time to go into archives and really sift through the resources of archives, because that takes a lot of time. And then in turn, archives need to be finding ways through projects such as this to really facilitate those processes. Because the process of turning every page, I mentioned Robert Caro earlier, he took decades just to sift through. I see you smiling, Tom. To turn every page takes decades, and you need a lot of money and you need a lot of time to do that. And if we're serious about doing that here in Hawaii, we need to be identifying ways to support that type of scholarship. That ties back to what I said about people being critically unaware of how things work in Hawaii. If we can have more of that going on, if we can have more understanding, and I think we get to the heart of the issue today, which is a lot of the distrust that I see among a lot of young people. Young people don't know how to approach these monoliths, these seeming monoliths like the H-3. They don't know how to engage with historical memory or processes. And so when we talk about what archives can do, I think, again, we need archivists who know how to engage with the people with the means and the time to turn every page. And in turn, we need to be identifying ways to perhaps support those scholars with the time and the resources to turn every page. I don't know if that's a good answer to that question or those questions, plural, but I think there's a huge need for that here in Hawaii.
Thank you to all three of you. This next question is more directed to panel 2, but anybody else can chime in. We know that the history of H-3 is still ongoing, so this question is not meant to imply that the doors to that history have closed. But what research do you think needs to be done on H-3? And are there any resources that our project points people toward that would be particularly useful for that research?
Yeah, thanks for that question. What I was trying to point out in my presentation is that I really thought that the historic preservation process had let down the folks that it was supposed to be working for. I believed at the time, I was just out of graduate school, and I still believe this, that it's possible to do Hawaiian archaeology in a way that honors the works of the people of old. I know a lot of people might not believe that or want to hear that, but I think that's the premise of much of the historic preservation work that was supposed to have been done with H-3. I showed a slide of how Bishop Museum promotes the reports, the archaeology reports that came out of H-3. And I described those reports as meeting minimal standards. I mean, you're not attracted to the layout of that website that promotes those reports. And you don't want to go in and try to read them. If you do, I can tell you firsthand that it's not easy going. They're dry as dust, most of them. And so it's very difficult to get something out. But at the same time, because I gave my career to archaeology and have actually learned some things from it about old Hawaii, I think that I'm almost sure that there is something interesting in that for archaeologists to give back to the people of Hawaii. And I think the website makes those resources available. I wanted to mention this earlier. Dory told me not to. But one of the things that really excited me first off is that I was able to go in through the parties drop down to Bishop Museum. And Bishop Museum used to have online free digital copies of all these reports. And I didn't bother to download them at the time. And I don't have hard copies of these things, which I reviewed most of them, or many of them, when I worked at SHPD. But then they disappeared. They disappeared. And when I saw that Bishop Museum was willing to sell me one for $9.95 or something like that, I said, no, I'm not going to do that. You got raised the hair in the back of my neck. And so your website has, I think it's called the Time Machine or the Wayback Machine. Is that what it's called? It's me back to that website that I remembered where I could download it for free. And I thought that was the most amazing, remarkable thing. And I wanted to thank you folks for putting that up there.
Key to a good marriage, easily amused people. Anyone else want to comment on anything that you'd like to see the researchers tackle?
I don't know if it's something the archivists can do, but there's something that needs to be done. They never did a complete archaeological study of Haiku Valley, which is a cultural complex affected by the highway, which touches two of the heiau in the valley. So that too is another obligation that the project has not complied with.
Tom, do you know what would prompt such a study to be done?
I don't know. We've got the congressionals working on it now.
Oh, okay.
How many times we had to do this, but anyway, we're trying to get.
Anyone else?
The only thing I would add is I like going forward. And I right. So it is the H-3 and right. You all have done a wonderful job, but it would also right like to ensure that it is a learning lesson. Like what are other highway projects that have heeded those lessons, right? Or have not heeded those lessons. Like, so yes, right. Like a body of work for H-3, but I also, and I share that. I mean, so the one that comes to mind is actually Saddle Road on Hawaii Island that we were also involved in. And like from day one, right. Our like standing orders from the senator was, we are not, this will never, ever, ever happen again. And if it doesn't go forward and if there isn't community consensus, we're not doing it. Right. And everything, so I think as you go forward, it would be interesting to start looking at different, were those lessons heeded or were they not heeded? Like, is there another situation that is worse or that I would be interested in? I mean, as you continue to do the research, because that then begins to provide community with lessons, right? Because so there never is another one, and that there is a roadmap of how to do it or how to be good about it or be honorable about it.
Well, there's a couple of projects on the Big Island, especially the Kona one, that they came up with a mitigation proposal from the community, which would have worked, and the state decided not to do it. And I'm thinking it was a relatively modest cost-wise. The guy died because they were denied that mitigation, and I'm thinking, oh, that's kind of sad. They didn't. Some people didn't. It could be bureaucracy. Stubbornness, don't want to listen to the lessons. Obviously, the senator did learn something, and all of us have learned something because we all made mistakes. But when we were part of the consultation group that helped with worked with the heart, and we were trying to get them to learn from H-3. So the archaeological study, we said, do it up front so you don't get it stuck later on. They didn't want to listen. So I mean, the bureaucracy is maybe the biggest humbug. All of us have dealt with it. You deal with it every day in the university system. So
yes, we do.
Okay, thank you. This question was submitted earlier. I didn't think I didn't know if we would have the expertise to answer this, but maybe we do. So I'll give it a shot. What transit solutions are there that can help protect cultural/heritage sites overdevelopment for communities and meet commuter needs today? And how can we support federal policies that prioritize these solutions? Barry, you're welcome to chime in on that as well.
We tried to get H-3's money switched to transit a long time ago. Failed, sorry.
All right, anybody else want to take a stab at that one, or we can move on to something else? Okay. All right, this is another one I got to read. Hold on a second. So this is another question submitted earlier. Let me read the question first. And then I want to rephrase the question for the library and archives panelists. And this includes you, Kavena. So here's the question. Do you have any concerns with Josh Green and the state of Hawaii's plans for rebuilding Lahaina? I think that this is me talking. I think there are two questions that can be related to what we are doing here today. The first question, can you see our project's framework being used? Can you see our project's framework being of use in analyzing what led up to the fires in Lahaina and what is yet to come? What changes to the framework would need to be made for Lahaina? The second question is for Kavena, and I want to start with you, and you've talked about it a little bit, but let's give you a little bit more time. Can you talk about the work happening to archive social media relating to the Lahaina fires? And where, if anywhere, do you see that archived content fitting in a framework similar to our project?
In terms of the social media stuff, we just met yesterday and we we looked at your website because we were like, how are we going to present this data? And like, what does that look like? And so again, I think I mentioned this earlier, like the timeline, I think really helps, like just visualizing that sort of in Lahaina, it's literally a catastrophe. And so I think that the website that you folks have made lays a good foundation for us in thinking about how we want this next set of data now to be used by people, because we can save it and then just keep it on hard drives, but that does no use. Or we could save it and put it in a like database that only we know how to, like we librarians know how to use, but what good does that do? So I think we were looking at your website yesterday to try and figure out, okay, like this would be like next steps, but what would it look like? And what can we do now to help what the outside facing portion would look like? And so I think that was the question. My ADHD went like ping ponging.
Consider us flattered. Does anybody else want to comment on Lahaina? And I was talking with Kyle about this a while back, and I said, I feel like somebody who's got a hammer and just sees everything as a nail, and I just think that this project can be applied to everything. But anyway, does any of the librarians or archivists want to talk about that? Really? Okay. All right.
One here.
No, Tom has it.
Tom, go ahead.
Thanks, Ann. The timeline thing I think is super important. People make their own history and they work with their own epistemologies, is the word that folks have been using here. They gain their knowledge in certain ways and they apply it, but they apply it to the events of the day. They apply it to what is going on at the time to solve particular problems, to get certain things done, to make sure other things don't get done. This is how history works. And if you don't have a timeline and you try to just abstract out epistemology, you don't really get at what people are experiencing and how they're putting that knowledge to work in particular situations. Timelines get you a big part of the way there. And so I'm a big fan of those.
Can I ask you a question? So like as an archaeologist and, trying to do archaeology reports in retrospect, how does that work? Like, the H-3 has already been built, but there's like pieces that are missing. So if you were to go back today, like in 2023, like how does that work when you're trying to do this report? The highway's already built. Like obviously there's been people like trampling through. How does that work?
Yeah. Well, first, I'm not going to do it myself.
Yeah.
Because I think it's going to be a lot of work. But for a young student, I think there are lots of ways to do this. And so I've been actually encouraging my colleagues at the university who work there and teach there to try to get a graduate student interested in this, because I think there's a bigger story to tell, and it's not getting out. I mean, it's the works of the people of old that were there, and they're recorded in minute detail that is at once baffling and kind of breathtaking. But nobody's really made any sense of that. There's nobody that got to the legislature's intent there. And it's produced anything that has nearly the impact of Eluku Vale. And I don't know if it's possible to do that, to do something as powerful as that book with just archaeological data. But I think there's a story there to tell. And the public spent tens of millions of dollars to dig things up and collect things and analyze things and report them. But the public didn't get back the things that would educate and inspire them. So it would take a lot of work and quite a bit of guidance from somebody like a professor with experience. On the way over, I'm sure I bored Kealohi to tears with a really detailed description of radiocarbon dating. And so working with the material that's been collected with techniques that are 30 years old is often very frustrating because the archaeologists at that time were using techniques that we would not use today because we know that they don't get us the information that we would like. And so you have to sift out a bunch of stuff to get at the real meat. But on the other hand, I think somebody mentioned that as a youngster, I think as Ellen mentioned, as a youngster, I was tasked with, I had 7 days and one assistant to walk all of Halava Valley and find all of the sites, which were completely overgrown, and we knew it didn't work. But when I got to the back of the valley, I knew people had been there. I could see that there's all kinds of canoe plants that were growing up there. There was ava growing near the stream. It was clear, but we couldn't find anything on the surface. The bulldozers came through and they found, was it 58, 63, I forget, emu up there. Folks had been coming there, cooking food, working, doing something. And Bishop Museum found these when the bulldozers went through. They come out as big round black spots in the tailings of the bulldozer when you're following the bulldozer. And they excavated those out and they identified everything that's in there. I think there's a story there. There's a story about what the forest looked like around at that time, what kind of plants were growing, what people were planting up there, and what they were cooking in these upland emu.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to read this next one. This is from Zoom. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh.
I just need a little bit of time to think about Lahaina. So my family is from the west side. We have ties in Lahaina for many generations. And so it was kind of hard for me to really wrap my mind around it because so much is going on and you're like, we want to see it rebuilt, it'll take time. And I really was thinking about what Auntie Mahealani was saying, how creating these archives, living archives with the kupuna and people who still have the active memories. Like my papa grew up in Lahaina and, hearing his stories now that, it's no longer there, like that's what we do have of what it was before. And, only from these stories and only from our kupuna, people who knew and were grown by this aina will know, like where the punavais are, like that connect the mountains to the ocean, like these are the little things that we can find in living archives through talking story with people who do have the memories. And, now that we have this, trying to look at the bright side of an opportunity to rebuild a Lahaina that we all deserve and want to see.
I think that's what's really going to be important, to keep those histories of, and, you know, collect those histories now while we still can. I also would be really interested in seeing a collection of what's going on with all these different organizations, you know, and Hui Aloha Aina. I know people are doing a lot of work, you know, Naikane, you know, the list goes on of everyone who's helping out. And so what does it look like for us to be moving in this rapid urgency response, and also tracing it to form pu'uhonua? And, you know, like, what does it look like to form this safe space? And, you know, I've had friends who are a part of the diaspora too, who mentioned like, oh, I didn't have a chance to come and be on island during, you know, everything with Mauna Kea. And so like, this is my first time being here and feeling what it's like for pu'uhonua to be actively made and community to show up for one another. And I think that's going to be so important to trace moving forward, and how we can continue to show up and form these systems of care and community, and inform for the future. Because with climate change, this isn't going to be the last natural disaster that comes up. And so I think having the most resources and having the most knowledge moving forward is going to be really critical.
Thank you. This is another question for Zoom that I'm just going to read because it's so flattering. Is there a framework or outline for the database that other projects could utilize to create their own databases? And if you saw the back end of that website, you'd be horrified. It's the most janky thing ever. But I'd be happy to talk to anybody who wants to talk about a janky Google sheet. And could you put my email address in the chat? Thanks, Kyle. Really feeling good about myself today. Okay. I have one more question from, well, actually I have a number of them, but this may be the last one for this afternoon. This question is that we received, is, I think, is premised on what we discovered was a common misperception about our project, that we were trying to create a central archive. And to be clear, we are not trying to do that. But here's the question. It's a statement and a question. As the attorney for Holaba Valley Coalition and other parties opposing H-3, I'd be reluctant to donate material to any H-3 archive that was not fully committed to telling the entire and complete story, including all aspects of the opposition, evidence of the violations of historic preservation law at the time, and now such as the ongoing lack of mitigation, and documenting the flagrant destruction of ancient sacred sites. Some of these stories have already begun to be erased from the record. Cultural erasure may have begun with colonization, but it's fundamental to the story of H-3 because the project was founded on the false premise that Holaba and Haiku valleys were not cultural treasures, which they are, and that was known at the time. How can I, as someone who lived through those days and fought against that needless destruction, be assured that a publicly funded archive will be complete, honest, and fully honor the Hawaiian people and all that was lost? And I want to start with Ellen for this question.
Well, I think that it's difficult to create a complete archive because of the ways in which people with community relations, like, you know, if it's institutional or cross-institution or community or institution or even just community-based, you know, these people have the relationships that fill trust, and they will preserve their history in the way that they know how. And because of colonization and because of projects that create these difficult tension, it's not easy to say, okay, let's work together to build an archive. There's going to be a lot of time that needs to pass in order for these honest, authentic relations to feel like we can share our information and understand the same context and we're coming from the same place. So we didn't that's why we couldn't even, for our project, it was really some resources that we could work with, because there were many more community groups and many more state agencies that we wanted to work with. But again, because of the time it takes to build relationships, it was not enough time. So, but that's okay, because our project was to talk about the political processes that shaped this history, the federal, state, the community, and all the different details within those three areas. And so we just wanted to show a method of looking at that process or that moment in Hawaiian history. And I think that's how we should look at it. It's not about hoarding papers. It's about a methodology of looking at the past.
Anybody else want to comment on that?
I just want to throw in something about developing a complete archive, whether it is of an event that is mostly in the past, like H-3, or whether it is something current, like the Lahaina fires. And that is that getting the information out of government offices can sometimes be quite challenging. I'll just share a little story. You know, when I was writing the contested case page, I wanted to know, well, where would you go to find the transcript of the contested case hearing and any of the documents that were supplied as a result of that in the process of that contested case hearing. And so I contacted the Board of Land and Natural Resources and asked them, do you have these? Where are they? And they referred me to the Attorney General's office. So I contacted the Attorney General's office and they said, oh, we don't have that. You have to go to the Board of Land and Natural Resources to get it. So I got the runaround. And, you know, I think that the basic problem is that sometimes government officials do not see it as their role to help librarians or the general public find documents from, you know, events that have happened in the past or even events that are currently happening. You know, their primary responsibility is to do what's in their position description, you know, and helping people find information is not maybe the top of their priority list. So, you know, if we wanted to build a complete archive of something, we might have to go and you know, do public access requests to collect that material, but we also have to bear in mind that not everything was retained. Eventually I learned that the Board of Land and Natural Resources didn't retain a lot of that stuff. It's not in a retention schedule. So in that case, if it's not retained, we could lobby the government to change the law or change the regulations as to what has to be kept. You know, how do you decide what's important enough to keep and what gets discarded? But, you know, that's another whole issue that goes into building a complete archive or telling a complete story is, you know, can we even get access to all of those government processes that happened?
Thank you. So I'm going to consider that our last question for today. And I want to ask if any of our panelists, either in the front of the room or now sitting around drinking coffee, if you have anything that you want to close with. And I'll start with panel 2.
Can I? I just want to say that librarians, we don't just shelve books all day, like from Gwen's story, from what you folks did, like from what everybody shared today. We librarians and archivists, like, we are not reading all the time when we're on the job. You know, we're not shelving books all the time. We're doing what Gwen's doing is we're trying to connect people to the information and to resources. And a lot of times we have to serve as that middle person, trying to like negotiate between, like, if it's government agencies and the people we're trying to help. And so we're not just reading all day or telling people to be quiet. Thank you.
I want to start by saying, I think people today are too distrustful, and I think we got to stop being distrustful. I trust most people. If I don't trust somebody, it's because my now is telling me not to trust somebody or not to go there. I would like to see this archival project, even though it sounds like it's done, to be a work in progress. Just like, to me, H3 is not done. It's a work in progress. There's work that's still to be done. The contested case hearing, I think, was to do with their commitment to the land board to remove all the things that were put in to build H3, which includes that access road and whatnot. So that one's not resolved yet. There's a mitigation that's supposed to be worked out. It hasn't been done. So H3 is not POW. They haven't mitigated haiku. They haven't done that resolved that issue of the CDUA. I think they had a conditional use permit to build H3. So they haven't resolved it. So a work in progress for both projects, I think, is what the proper description should be. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question before I close. So is this a trend nationally? Like, is this where librarians and archivists are much more active and like being, you know, like gatherers and sharing in community? Or is this something that is more of a Hawaii? Because I think it's wonderful.
I think it's a responsibility that is shared between librarians and archivists and other groups like historians or political scientists. I know that some of my colleagues on the mainland who are government documents librarians like I am, did a research project that was based on on an internment camp in Louisiana where Hawaii internees and others were imprisoned during World War II. So there are projects, they may not be a website like this. In that case, that project turned out to be, I think, some articles and books, but there are librarians and archivists who are out there doing projects that pull out untold stories.
Thank you. Yeah,
Okay.
no, so thank you for thank you for including me. I think it's wonderful, and I do think that, as I said, I mean, history is a wonderful teacher if you know it and apply it. Otherwise, we're gonna make a mistake again. And so I think by continuing this effort, looking at other projects, I know you're rolling your eyeballs at other projects, but looking at other projects and opportunities, you know, that help engage community, whether it's historic or concurrent. I think it's wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Tom? Okay, I can't believe that. Aloha. Anyone else? Perry? Oh.
I just wanted to thank Dory and Dawn and Gwen for kind of being the core group that kept us together. I know we had disagreements here and there, but I thought that we all were such a good team, and I felt really supported, and I felt really like there was an alignment with our passion for what we're trying to do. So I want to thank you guys, and I also want to thank Kealohi, Kyle, and Perry, and also Kylie, who wasn't able to attend today, for their support and helping us in the different, and Jasmine for helping us in the different parts of this project, because it couldn't happen without you guys' help as well. So, and thank you to all the panelists for coming and speaking and sharing your feedback on our resource, because it does help us to improve our project and our work moving forward. So mahalo.
Okay, so I'll turn this back over to Ellen to close out the program.
So thank you, everyone. Thank you to our Zoom audience and our in-person audience for joining us today. We hope that this event began to answer questions about political processes behind the H-3 freeway. And we hope that we inspired more questions within you to pursue further research and learning. And don't forget to support your local library and archives. Mahalo.
Thank you for your nice words.
Adrian needs to stand up.
Your projects are really neat.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
We're trying. It's